This is such a weird game in so many ways, I'm not even sure where to begin. The story can get lame and pretentious at times, but the dialogue is a blast to see play out. The combat is terribly unbalanced, but there is enough variety to work with that you're bound to find something you'll enjoy. And the game encourages switching things up by trying out different jobs and weapons. It can be very challenging, maybe even feeling unfair at times, but one of the main strengths is that the game always stays true to its rules and principles that are laid out from the start. Oftentimes, beating a boss doesn't require dumb gimmicks or cheap tactics, you simply have to get good at it. And that's what I want out of my video games. No nonsense, no stupid time wasting, get me in the game, get me to the good parts, and let me play, period. After how slow-paced and long-winded Elden Ring was, this was a breath of fresh air that I desperately needed. It's far from perfect, Stranger of Paradise has a lot of problems, but it's still a game that I thoroughly enjoyed. The story is an interesting retelling of the original Final Fantasy I. The basic idea is there, 3 Warriors of Light, along with a 4th and a 5th one later on. They mysteriously appear out of the blue one day with the mission to restore power to the elemental crystals of the world and ultimately kill chaos. However, there's quite a few things that don't line up properly, but it all gets explained in time. The final plot reveal is pretty cool, and it has some neat implications for the greater Final Fantasy universe. I say to stick with it to the end and read all the journal entries you collect. It's not the most amazing story, but I think it's worth it to see how all the loose ends get tied up. How the story is paced and presented is another thing. The first half of the game is a total joke. I remember reading a comment on YouTube somewhere where someone said, "It's refreshing to see a protagonist who wants to skip all the cutscenes," and that is so accurate.
I'm a dark elf, you see. And we dark elves...
Just tell us about the crystals. That's all I want to know.
At the risk of giving the game too much credit, it's a fun commentary on older video game tropes where story wasn't too big of a focus, and you basically did stuff just because there were enemies to kill. Simple as that. After the halfway point, the story progression slows down a lot and things start to get more pretentious. This is the low point of the game for sure, but it does pick up again during the last quarter and the ending is great. During its best moments, it kind of reminds me of a similar tone that Metal Gear Rising was going for. Nowhere near as ridiculous or as good, but I respect the effort and I think they did a good job overall.
So I take it you're the one who stole the Earth Crystal's shine.
The crystal's gentle waves resonate through the verdant land, enriching the soil and nurturing the trees. Harvests are bountiful, and from summit to sea, people sing the praises of the earth. A foolish dream, no matter how much you wish it, that season will never come. It will remain a dream so long as I live. Who I am,
I don't give a fuck who you are!
I am Lich, and I shall devour all that is good.
Visually, it's a hit and miss. During gameplay, everything looks awesome. Different locales to explore, each one very unique to the others, cool enemy design, solid animations, everything's good all around. Then you get to some of the in-game cutscenes, and it looks like a budget game. The animation is pretty bad, even when it's as simple as just 2 characters standing still and talking to each other. And I can't quite put my finger on it. There's just something off with, I don't know, the textures or maybe the polygon count or something. I don't know. It's so weird and it looks bad. Keep in mind, I'm playing the PlayStation 5 version of the game too. Like, this is how the game is supposed to look optimally. About half of the in-game cutscenes are like this, but it's easy enough to look past and most of the game is nice. The music is alright. Sometimes it's really good. An awesome mix of operatic vocals and high-energy beats to get you hyped. But most of the time, it's just background music that easily gets lost in the action. One thing's for sure, I wish the game had different battle music for each of the areas. The same exact song starts up every time an enemy sees the player, and it gets old fast. Still, good enough. The music does the job, not too bad. Just don't expect any of the really masterful tracks, like from Final Fantasy VII Remake or Final Fantasy XIV. As for the gameplay, level design, and mission structure, the short of it is, if you've played Nioh, an earlier game by the same development team, a lot of this should appear very familiar. Missions are selected from a world map and are very enclosed linear levels with a defined start and finish, much like a traditional video game. Completing each mission obviously unlocks the next one, but it also opens a side mission in a previously completed area. Again, similar to Nioh, a lot of these side missions use recycled areas, and they usually come down to simply going through the stage in reverse. But the enemy layout is always different and the combat is fast-paced, so it's actually not so bad. If you haven't played Nioh before, these styles of games are closer to Bloodborne due to the speed, but it's definitely a lot faster still. You've got the typical lock-on, R1 to attack, dodge enemy attacks, etc, etc. Stranger of Paradise does its own thing though. There's no stamina for starters, which also means that Nioh's flux mechanic is absent as well. The weapon stances are out too, making Stranger's combat a lot more simplified as a result. Instead of stamina, they use what's called the break gauge, which depletes as you take damage. If it empties, then you'll be broken and placed into a very long stun animation, which can easily lead to death. If you've played Sekiro, it's actually pretty similar in that game, but it's a lot more punishing in Strangers of Paradise. Since there's no stamina, there's absolutely no restrictions on the player's actions. They can attack, block, and sprint at any time. But while doing so won't cost you anything, it will significantly slow down the break gauge's recovery. And you need to keep your break gauge high, not just to help take hits, but also to use the soul shield mechanic. This is what the entire game is built around, and it can be seen as something akin to a parry in other games, although don't get confused, parrying is another mechanic in Stranger of Paradise, but it's not that big of a deal. Anyway, by holding down the soul shield button, you rapidly drain your own break gauge. The idea is to time it just before an enemy's attack makes contact, allowing you to deflect their blow. But the part I find interesting is that the window of opportunity is theoretically massive, but not without risk. If you end up draining your entire break gauge just to deflect a single attack, well then that was a total waste and you may have severely compromised your position. Even worse, if you end up draining the whole meter and you don't deflect anything at all, then you're really in trouble. You can't simply spam the button either, as there's a long pause between attempts. It's a really easy mechanic to use and understand, but it's also really easy to lose control of it as well. It requires both precision and patience to use effectively. I like it, it's pretty awesome. While the enemy can never use Soul Shield themselves, they do have their own break gauge, and depleting it opens them up to a one-shot kill. So, also, similar to Sekiro, you either whittle down their health or break their posture to kill them. Much like traditional RPGs, this is your resource for magic and special abilities. Stranger of Paradise rewards effective play by raising your maximum MP, mainly done by successful deflections with the soul shields and killing enemies by breaking them. Your maximum MP resets at the start of every mission, and it also resets whenever you die. But it is a really strong bonus that's worth maintaining. The most powerful spells also lower your maximum MP, so you'll need to strike a balance if that's what you're going for. Best of all, the break and MP meters are actually designed to work together. You can end your combos with powerful attacks to push the enemy away and give yourself time to recover your break gauge, or use an ability like Sway Back to recover your break gauge instantly at the cost of MP as well. By the same token, landing attacks and successful deflections will compromise your break gauge, but in exchange, it will restore your MP. This constant back and forth is a big part of what makes Stranger of Paradise so fun. As long as you're conscious about your meter usage and you're effective at using Soul Shield to deflect and MP costing abilities for additional damage and break recovery, then you can constantly stay in the fight with very little downtime. This game is so damn cool about that. It's paced around being aggressive, but it's not brain dead either. You need to be very aware of what's going on at all times. Perhaps best of all, the base mechanics are easy enough to grasp that you'll get a handle on what the game expects of you sooner than later, but it's still challenging enough that it stays exciting to the end. They just nailed it. When the combat works, it's so good. The key phrase, of course, is when it works. There are a bunch of issues that hold it back. Perhaps biggest of all is the weapon balancing. Fist weapons are just straight up out of control. They are hands down the best weapons in the game for their speed and combos. If you get an enemy in the corner, it's not uncommon at all to just pummel them to death with basic attacks. Katanas are also crazy good, and the special move with the breaker job has gotta be the single best move in the whole game. Aside from leveling up the other jobs, the only time I would mix things up is against a handful of very specific bosses. The Great Marlboro is way too resilient against blunt attacks to make punching a viable option, and using a shield against Marilith is very helpful. But otherwise, it's almost entirely fists and sometimes katanas for me. The larger weapons are good for crowd control and range, but that doesn't mean much against the weaker enemies, and the stronger ones will power through your attacks without flinching anyway. The other weapons aren't bad. The Great Axe in particular is a lot of fun since it's based around charged attacks and hyper armor, but as far as raw effectiveness goes, I've found a very clear hierarchy in the weapons. I could be wrong, but that's how I found the game. Now that's not even going into magic. It's not the ideal solution for most situations, but it's so insanely good in particular instances that you'll always want one of the mage jobs as your secondary. You can switch between two jobs at any time with the press of a button, and in a way, this actually serves a similar function to Neo's Flux mechanic. With proper timing, you can cancel certain animations with a job switch, and each job has its own break gauge, allowing the player to stay on the offensive up until the last second, and then switch jobs to safely continue attacking. Part of the problem with this is that it's just so much easier to rely on the sway back ability for restoring your break, and having a mage job at the ready at any time is way too strong of an option not to have, especially once you unlock the Sage and you can use the Ultima spell. It is completely nuts. I don't want to be too harsh on that aspect because the game is clearly based around swapping between different jobs freely. However, that itself is another issue. They've carried over a similar loot-based system that was used in Neo, as well as other popular action RPGs like Borderlands and Diablo. In all of those games, it's not so bad because you're sticking with one character the whole time. Even if you wanted to transfer your favorite equipment to other characters, it's not like you have a whole lot to juggle anyway. In Stranger of Paradise, you have to handle a total of 27 jobs, and a 28th job after you complete the main story. So after every mission, you gotta slowly scroll through your inventory and dismantle the gear you don't want. The best gear tends to have high affinity, which is that percentage number to the right. Higher affinity not only provides an experience point bonus, but also unlocks some incredibly powerful passive abilities later on. You really want that 400% affinity whenever possible. So you'll want to be careful not to throw away any equipment that you might actually want to use while leveling up all the jobs through your initial playthrough. This wouldn't be so bad if I could just organize all the gear by their individual jobs, that way I can easily throw away the jobs that I don't care about. Like, once you unlock Samurai and Breaker, there's pretty much no reason to use Ronin ever again. But you keep getting a bunch of equipment for the basic jobs all the way to the end of the game. I'm not kidding, this is seriously a really big deal. It can take a surprising amount of time, like 5 or 7 minutes straight of just looking at boring menus when you want to get right back into the game. It might sound like I'm exaggerating, and yes, you can just dismantle the lower half of your inventory and hope for the best, but this is a problem that the game should not have. It shouldn't showcase a clear path to min-maxing and then make that path as cumbersome as possible. A patch after the game launch did include an automatic dismantling feature, but the filters are nowhere near robust enough, especially not for the initial playthrough. Honestly, let me organize and filter by job, and probably my single biggest complaint is gone. I mean, preferably, I don't think this game needs to have this type of equipment drop system at all. It's just a grinding incentive to give players an excuse to keep playing the endgame over and over, but it doesn't actually add a whole lot to the gameplay itself. Isn't it enough that you're already choosing between and leveling up close to 30 different jobs? Not to mention the equipable active abilities and combo enders on top of all that. And you also get so much samey gear in this game that it quickly loses value. It really comes off like, what's the point? I just hate how the equipment system can act as a speed bump, slowing down the game in unimpactful and unnecessary ways. Granted, if you play on the action difficulty and rely on co-op, then you can likely ignore a lot of this fluff. You can simply have the game automatically optimize your equipment, although it completely ignores affinity, so you're getting less than optimal experience bonuses, as well as skipping out on those insanely powerful passive bonuses. So it's hardly very well optimized, that's for sure. Regardless, if you've watched a bunch of my stuff already, then you know how stubborn I can be. I'd rather not rely on help from others to complete a challenging single-player game. So I played through the whole thing on hard, completely solo. And I had a great time. The game's good. Damn good even. Again, the weapon balancing is an issue. Whenever I had a hard time, it basically came down to just going back to using the fist weapons or use magic, and I was instantly fine. The later levels also get carried away with having enemies gang up on you, a similar issue that Neo had in that sense, which is always obnoxious. Certain enemies, like Tonberries, are also insanely cheap, but they can be dealt with once you manage to figure them out, even if I still think that they're too strong, especially with their ranged attacks. But putting my complaints aside, the game is great for like 80% of the time. It's fun to run up to enemies, land some blows, deflect their attacks, and then counterattack them in turn. It's difficult to pull off efficiently, but very satisfying when it all comes together. The boss fights are such big highlights too. They can come off as really cheap at first, but it never feels hopeless. You just have to learn the attack patterns and react appropriately, simple as that. After losing once to a boss, the game provides some advice on how to win, which is pretty cool since it's easy to overlook things when you have so many options to work with. But at the end of the day, beating the boss is up to you as a player, and it feels fair to overcome that challenge and satisfying when you pull it off. A couple of other things to go over before I close this out. It's worth noting that they bring back the named attacks from Final Fantasy XIV, and more notably from Final Fantasy VII Remake. You still have to react to enemy motions for their basic attacks, but these named attacks will warn the player of particular offenses. Orange is the basic type, red names are unblockable and usually grabs, but dodging them will leave the enemy wide open, and purple names are where it gets interesting. If you deflect a purple attack with the Soul Shield, you actually steal that attack for yourself. I suppose this can be seen as Stranger in Paradise's version of the Blue Mage job from previous Final Fantasy games. You can only hold one attack at a time, and they have very limited uses, but they're really powerful options to easily defeat opponents. Like I've said in my reviews of those other games, I really like the named attack system, but it's probably not going to change your mind if you were never a big fan of it. The last thing worth mentioning is that this game is surprisingly pretty short. I say surprisingly because Neo was an insanely long game, but I feel like Stranger of Paradise has less than half of that game's content. It took me about 50 hours to 100% the game, not counting all the stuff that's unlocked after the credits roll, which is a lot. But most people will likely get through it a lot faster on easier difficulties and if they rely on co-op, either online co-op or with AI party members. That said, it's still decent, don't get me wrong, it's not like it's necessarily lacking, just don't go into this expecting Neo's overwhelming number of missions. That's about all I have to say. Stranger of Paradise has a great foundation, but its flaws are due to some genre carryover that don't have a place here. It shares similar annoyances as Neo, namely dogpiling enemy numbers at times, and the level design is even more linear than usual, although they do some cool stuff here and there. The biggest downfall is the way that loot distribution and organization is handled. It does little else than just get in the way, and such a small, simple thing should not be an issue. It's not even that rewarding when you get this stuff because so much of it is the same anyway. The option of online cooperative play is always a welcome touch, and thankfully it's not required at all. Even for computer-controlled allies and on the hard difficulty, you can play through the whole game solo without too much of an issue. But the balance between weapons and jobs is certainly questionable. A lot of them are really fun, but less than half of them I would consider to be actually viable in the endgame. Anyway, when the game is at its peak, it's extremely fun. The constant back and forth of deflect and attack reminds me of Sekiro. Not quite as good, but it's in a similar ballpark. It's just a shame how much else of the game holds itself back. Thanks for watching my review on Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin. Man, that title's a mouthful. What a bad name for a game. Still, recommend it. This game's pretty awesome.